Welcome everybody today to the CUI Primer. Learn how to establish and maintain a CUI program for your organization. We're joined today with Christina Reynolds of BDO and Bill Wootton with C3 Integrated Solutions. Bill, why don't I pass things over to you? You can get us started with introductions of Christina.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I'm kind of watching the attendees. We're getting great participation today, great attendance, and really excited about today's program. You know, when we have these webinars and these presentations that look at compliance and CMMC, we get ourselves kind of wrapped up into the controls and what cloud do we go to and what's an assessment going to look like. So many times we kind of skip the first and most important steps before we get to all those topics, and that is, what type of data are you handling, how are you handling that data, and how are you establishing the system boundaries around that CUI data. Christina, who's going to lead the presentation today, is just an absolute rock star in that space. She is fantastic. Her program is smart, it's methodical, and it is so informative. At the end of it, you're going to feel so much better about where you are, whether you're just at the beginning of this process or fairly mature on it. There's a lot to learn in the way she presents this data. So with that build up and that introduction, Christina, I'll let you take it away and go for it.
Well, thanks, Bill. You're absolutely too kind, and definitely you've been a good resource for me as well. So kind of where I want to start, and I don't know how many of you have seen The Sound of Music, but there's one song, and I won't punish you with my singing, that says, let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. And of course, you start by singing Do, Re, Mi, but at the beginning of our discussion, we will be singing FCI CUI. So I want to make sure I've got control here. So we're going to be going through where you start, even before, like Bill said, we get to a point at which we say, okay, we know where CUI is and we know what steps we need to take to control it. The very first question I have from a lot of my clientele is, what is CUI? Do we have it? The government doesn't seem to know. So we're at a point of defining and creating their comprehensive CUI program. And as we start at the very beginning, one of the things that we have to start with is first defining FCI. So many of you government contractors, as you know, when you receive a government contract, you get these clauses in your contract that the government expects you to adhere to, called the Federal Acquisition Regulation. If you have a Department of Defense contract, not only do you receive FAR clauses that stipulate what terms you must abide by on the contract, but you might receive Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation supplement clauses. So at the very beginning, we need to look at the cyber clauses that affect the baseline. Where do you start in terms of cybersecurity and classification for specific data types? And the first place you're going to start is FCI. Now, this is passed down, the whole definition of federal contract information is passed down through the FAR Clause 52-204-21. And this establishes your basic layer of safeguarding. A few of the interesting things you need to know about starting at defining federal contract information is this FAR clause lays down not only a definition of FCI and what that is, and I've been told to stop doing this, but it actually tells you how to safeguard that lowest threshold of data that we expect all defense and federal contractors to have to meet as a minimum foundational layer of security. So what this FAR clause really does is it just defines your basic cyber hygiene as anticipated by the federal government. What is the basic things you should be doing as a prerequisite to where you start? Now, it is important to note a few different things about this. First and foremost, the definition of FCI. Their formal definition is information not intended for public release that is provided by or generated for, so there's two prongs to that. The government gives it to you, or you generate it and give it to the government under a contract to deliver or develop a product or service to the government, but not including information provided by the government to the public, such as on public websites. And a great example of that is the SAM database. Simple transactional information, such as necessary to process payments. So they lay down a layer of safeguarding instruction for FCI before we even hit CUI or we even discuss it. This is where we start. So in the definition of basic cyber hygiene, this clause lays down 17 security controls that you need to implement. Now, we can cross-map these security controls to the later CUI controls that we have to implement. So it's good to note that when you start with these 17 controls, you won't have to repeat them over again as a level 1 control later on. And I'll show you how that plays in with CUI. And of course, as FAR clauses go, and we'll talk about the DFARS clauses, you are mandated to pass this down to your subcontractors. So if you receive the FAR clause in your prime contract, the government anticipates you will mandatorily flow this down to your subcontractors so that they, in turn, are safeguarding FCI. So let's talk about kind of that differentiation between FCI and CUI. So when we look at, and I'll give you the definition of CUI in a second, we look at both of them. They both really discuss this information either created for the government or the government sends you. And so it starts to get a little confusing. A lot of people say, well, this sounds a lot like the definition for CUI. So while FCI is information that is not anything that is not intended for public release, CUI information is something that's going to be on a much higher threshold. But in essence, all CUI in possession of a government contractor is FCI by default, but not all FCI is CUI. So at this point, I'm guessing all of this is probably as clear as mud to you. You're probably more confused now. So let me draw you a diagram. So this is kind of the basic overarching diagram. Our minimum threshold is FCI. And you'll notice that the CUI bubble falls inside of FCI. So at minimum, everything that the government gives us, we classify at a minimum of FCI. How does this really play out for you? Technically speaking, because the minimum baseline is FCI, it means you always must start with those 17 controls as a minimum baseline for your entire network. And not all of those controls apply to your network. Some of those controls are administrative, things that you need to be doing with your physical security of your environment, not just your information security flowing through your networks. So when we look at this Venn diagram, we can see that CUI is a subset of FCI, meaning that you may have information that at minimum must be protected to FCI level, but at maximum must be protected to CUI. And I'll get into it in a little bit later that even CUI itself has kind of a high watermark because any export control data like ITAR will have a US data sovereignty requirement. So not only do you have to put all the CUI protections around that, but then you now have to make sure that everything is US sovereign. Whereas we see outside of that Venn diagram, anything that is publicly posted is not included under FCI or CUI. So typically we look at SAM, Beta SAM, we look at anything that's publicly posted on a website, social media, anything that's been decontrolled. If it was CUI, it was decontrolled or sanitized. So we can see things that have been publicly posted that might have had their markings reduced. As long as it's publicly posted, it's pretty much automatically decontrolled at that point. So we'll get into more of that, what all of that means. So again, FCI is non-public information. So if you see and go bid an RFP that is posted on SAM, that's publicly posted information. If you chose to publicly post that same information to your website or anything else that's publicly posted, it's unclassified, it's not included under FCI. However, if you exchange information during a proposal bid, an RFP or an RFI phase, During the award phase, contract mods, those things automatically become FCI. And one of the things I really want to point you to is really back to the words federal contract information. It really is meant to be self-explanatory there. It's important to note that FCI does not include technical information. So if you had technical designs or drawings that you delivered to the government or that you received from the government, those are probably going to fall under the category of CTI. And we'll go over some of those CTI/CUI categories. Every contractor in the defense industrial base will handle FCI at a minimum. So if you're asking yourself, well, gee, I've never seen this FAR clause in my contracts, the government expects that you are already meeting that minimum threshold of safeguarding for federal contract information. So when we go back to our Sound of Music song, let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. Here in this song, it's FCI, and that's where all of us will start if we work in the defense industrial base. So let's go over some of the, if you want to clear up some of that confusion, like give me some examples. So number one, obviously I talk about contract information. So again, keyword federal contract information. Contract information is one of the number one data types I discuss that we typically see is categorized under FCI. Any emails exchanged with DOD and the defense contractor, proposal responses, I would even go under that and say RFI responses may be considered FCI, contract performance reports, organizational programmatic charts, process documentation, past performance documentation, and again, that threshold being as soon as we start to talk about technical products, that's where it's going to slip into that slippery slope of CUI. So know where that line is drawn and be prepared to also defend where that line is drawn. And this will help us reduce the amount of overmarking that's occurring. Because every DoD contract contains FCI, every contractor will at least require the CMMC level 1. So level 1 controls are identical to the FAR clause controls. And they did that on purpose because we are meant to take this as an approach of meeting your level 1 controls, then meeting your new CMMC model 2.0 level 2 controls. So right now, what you're looking at is if you do business with the federal government, if you do business with the DoD, meet the 17 controls as your first step. So we're gonna have some fun with our polls because I really want you guys to be awake and alert and paying attention and hopefully laughing. So this poll is gonna come out and I want you to just take a good look at the picture, take a look at the answers, and then we're going to roll this first poll.
Thanks, Christina. So poll number 1, which should you follow to meet compliance? Number 1, CMMC level 2. Number 2, DFARs. That's a lot of numbers. Number 3, NIST 800-171, or yes, we'll launch the little poll software here real quick. You can provide your answers. So looks like our poll is in, and it is got a lot of folks kind of divided between the 3, right? The DFARS 252, NIST 800-171, and a good portion of just say yes. So there you go.
And that one was meant to be a complete joke. NIST 800-171 is actually the framework that both CMMC level 2 and DFAR 7012 points to. So really all 3 are right. So if you guessed yes, you're probably on a good path and you probably have a pretty good understanding. Mostly I love this picture and it makes me laugh every time. So big fan of Saturday Night Live. So we'll move on, and what we want to do next, make sure my buttons work here. So what we want to do next is start to get into what is CUI. So now that we kind of have a good threshold for FCI, we want to start tapping in CUI. And so what we want to do is look over that next clause. So we started with the FAR clause. Now we're going to dig a little deeper into the Department of Defense Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement Clause 252-204-7012, or a lot of times I casually reference it as DFAR 7012, so you'll probably hear me reference it as that. So this was laid down. We saw this come out and around, really come into effect in contracts in 2016. Of course, they were waving it around in 2015, and a lot of contractors were having to take a close look at really what was CUI and understand it. And I can safely say that several years later, I know a lot of most of the contractors that I work with still don't have a good understanding of CUI. So if you feel like you're in that category, you're in good company. And I'm here to tell you that with utmost confidence. A lot of people that I consult with give me the same. I don't know what CUI. I don't know what CUI on our system. So we see this as, part of our scoping and analysis that we do when we start working with a client. The very first thing I will do is not give you a gap assessment, because the very first thing we need to do is understand what part of your organization is affected by CUI, how it flows through your systems, which personnel use CUI on a daily basis. A lot of these questions need to be asked in terms of scoping before you can assess that part of the network that actually transfers CUI through it or stores CUI upon it. So when we start with the DFARS clause, the whole intent is to safeguard covered defense information. Now, it's kind of hard because the DoD likes to throw out new acronyms a lot. And I worked for the DoD for 22 years, and every day was like a new acronym. And if you said, wait, covered defense information does not sound like controlled unclassified information, it's really where they started, really to protect defense information that they considered covered or controlled, and to really wrangle all the marking that we had, and we'll go over what some of the legacy marking is, and put them under one umbrella marking that was a catch-all for sensitive data types. But then the next question is once we have these sensitive data types and we can actively put them in a categorization that everybody can understand what they are, how do we safeguard them? Where are they flowing to? What systems have open vulnerabilities? And really start a dialogue for how to secure the systems that contain this data. So one of the first things that DFAR 7012 does is it defines what controlled unclassified information is. It is a law, regulation, or government-wide policy that requires your organization to have safeguarding or dissemination controls, excluding information that is classified under Executive Order 13526. It also helps establish, through the executive order, the NAIRA archives, which became this classification for all the CUI categories that the government wants to control and safeguard. It does a number of other things under this clause that you have to be aware of. Number one, it wants you to provide, just as the FAR clause did, adequate security. But instead of pointing to like the 17 controls that are embedded in the FAR clause, this one points to a separate framework that's established by NIST. And it is a tailored special publication framework, 800-171, that has 110 security controls just dealing with CUI, and an additional 60 controls for dealing with what it calls non-federal organization controls. And consider those your baseline controls. Nobody ever talks about them. I'm going to talk about them. So if this has been a new concept to you, I'm about to show you what that means. Again, we have that mandatory flow down to subcontractors. It is a requirement. It helps you safeguard covered defense information. That's an older term. They are going to be rolling that term underneath and kind of coinciding it with CUI, and CUI will be the prevailing term. They will be rolling out covered defense information just to clear everything up according to the ISU blogs. It also requires a few other things in terms of event or incident reporting. If you have an event or an incident that occurs that has relation to your CUI data that is transmitting or being stored upon your systems, or other event. Somebody broke into your office and they broke into the office that processes CUI, maybe paper documents were taken, a laptop was stolen. These sorts of cyber incidents need to be reported to DIBnet within 72 hours. You may not have all the information at that time, but you still must make the report. And then DIBnet will follow up with you to gather more information. I joke, and in all seriousness, this is a mandatory program that is also largely volunteer information driven. They really do rely on this information to keep the educational information out to the DIB components, to notify them of active threats in the community, who the targets are, what the threats are, things that we see. So this really is an informational feedback system. But it also helps them notify contract officers if CUI data was compromised, that the contract officers are also aware of that. You also need to report malicious software that you see. They may also want a copy of whatever you've been able to capture forensically, and you help the DIB facilitate a damage assessment. So what is CUI? So again, information that the government creates or possesses, or that an entity, your organization, creates or possesses for or on behalf of the government. So again, this is two-pronged. You may receive it from the government, but you may also have to generate work products as a part of your contract that you will then be required to label as CUI. So having this first and foremost understanding of what CUI is going to help you establish what we're talking about today, which is establishing a CUI program and documenting that. And this takes a lot of coordination with your contract authorities to have a great and well-informed understanding of what the CUI is on your specific contract. So one of the interesting things about CUI is they have categories of CUI that are considered either CUI basic, and CUI basic will have just a CUI marking header on it, or CUI specified. So we have top level categories of CUI and then sub-level categories underneath those categories that specify very specifically what that information is. So CUI basic is requiring or permitting agencies to control or protect the information, but providing no specific controls. In other words, we're not looking at a subcategory. We're just saying it's CUI. Here's a top level category. It falls under this generically. CUI specified, I really prefer as a route to identifying CUI, because it helps us get into not only a specific subcategory of CUI, but it helps us manage that category and mark our documents according to the specific category. And there may be a little bit of both, CUI specified, but with CUI basic controls where the authority does not specify, requiring or permitting agencies to control the information and specifying only some of those controls, which makes the information CUI specified, but with CUI basic. So how do we even identify that? So this is direct from the NAIRA website. And what we're seeing is just the top of their categorization for the CUI categories. And you'll see on the left-hand side is kind of that top level category. So critical infrastructure is one of those top level categories. And then you see those subcategories on the right. And as soon as you start sliding into what specific category do we have on the right, that's when it becomes specified. So you may say, I have CUI basic, it may fall under the critical infrastructure or the defense. A lot of you may be familiar with the defense categories, controlled technical information being a subcategory. And how this looks like when you go to the NAIRA website, if you click further, and let's say I was going through the defense controlled technical information subcategory, it will bring up this page, and I have it in two sections here. But you see at the top, I've highlighted the banner marking. So for controlled technical information, which may include anything in this category description, So it might be a military or space application that is subject to controls on the access, use, reproduction, modification, performance, display, release, disclosure, dissemination. It's a lot of stuff, right? We tend to think of anything in that last sentence. Examples of technical information include research and engineering data, engineering drawings and associated lists, specifications, standards, process sheets, manuals, technical reports, technical orders, and the list goes on and on. But you can see they have worked a great deal to clear up what would fall under CTI. Now, the banner marking for any of these documents will likely be either controlled or CUI, or you may have the specified banner marking CUI//SP for the specified category /CTI. A great way, a lot of these categories will look very similar, but to get more information, you scroll down to the bottom of this category and they will have 48 CFR information that you can click on to get more specific information on what applies to this category. So what I encourage you to do is, if you are walking through an exercise with your contract authority and you are saying, okay, well, we believe, or our contract officer believes that this information is CUI//SPCTI, what I encourage you to do is click on this bottom link, and some of these controls have multiple reference documents, and read the information, because the information will give you very specific details on what work products, what documents, what data will fall under that definition, and you will get a much bigger picture underneath that. So when you look at the NAIRA CUI categories, what you will see is they have yet another matrix here, which tells you all the specified and the basic categories. So you can see under basic, you're going to see CUI, and you can see that for things like agriculture. If you go across, you're going to see that the banner marking basic authorities is CUI and it has no specified category. But some of the sub-level categories under agriculture are going to have the specified category as well as the banner marking CUI. So this is a case where you might get specified, you might get mixed. What this comes down to is that you need to perform a very diligent exercise with your contract authorities to collect this information. We might have a manual on a product that we've built. If this manual is CUI, what category specifically are we marking it to? And you must perform this exercise to understand how to properly safeguard the information as it flows through your system. So let's talk about legacy CUI. And I do keep my eyes on the questions. We're going to answer a lot of them at the end, because I will be probably answering a lot of your questions as we go along. I've done this particular presentation to a lot of my clients, and a lot of the stuff I'm going to be answering as I go along. So let's talk about legacy CUI, because I did see a question pop up on legacy CUI. So legacy CUI is the most common question I get. The first question I get is, how do we know what CUI information we're processing if we never have received the document that's marked CUI? One of the first indicators I use with my clients is, what legacy CUI do you have? So the things you're seeing on this list, this doesn't include all the legacy CUI categories. I do have some more on the next page, but these are the ones I typically see pretty much fresh out of the gate. So the first question I ask my clients is, do you have any FOUO documents? Because those are the ones I typically see all over federal contract information documents, as well as CTI, or the controlled technical information documents. I see a lot of FOUO. And FOUO is a great indicator of a legacy CUI document that may become CUI. Notice I use the word may, because it is not an automatic process. And I will get into the DOD instruction that says that explicitly, so that you have some pieces of evidence to take with you at the end of this. Notice that I also have export controlled data in its own little rectangle. While it is considered CUI, again, there's a high watermark here that requires US data sovereignty. So how does this play into cybersecurity? Well, your servers must be on US soil. That includes your cloud service providers. So when you are working with Microsoft solutioning, you have to go to the Microsoft federal government side of their solutions and products. And you have to go to the FedRAMP high solutions and products that maintain adequate protections specifically for export controlled or no foreign data. That means the servers are on US soil, and the personnel that service that are also US citizen. I think minimum green card is acceptable. So we have to make sure that ITAR data is protected at the highest level. The other forms you see here, we have sensitive but unclassified, DOD controlled technical data, law enforcement sensitive. If you see any of these data types, that's a very good indication that while your program with your contract authority may not have fully implemented the CUI data protections, they are coming. So a real quick discussion, I will go into depth a little bit more than this. Another element of concern with my clients has been, well, one of the categories on CUI is PII. So does that mean all of our company PII is CUI? Not necessarily. So what you see in this diagram is your PII is protected under privacy controls, but the minute you send it to the government has to protect your PII or PHI as CUI, and vice versa. So let's say you have a government contract with the VA, you have built and managed a database on behalf of the VA that holds both PII and PHI, or either or. At that point in time, the government's PII and PHI, when it's transferred to your system, now must be protected as CUI. So that's one of those little tricky persnickety things. Your own PII must be protected under privacy controls, but the minute you send it to the government, they must safeguard it as CUI. The government's PII and PHI, when sent to you, you must safeguard that as CUI. So we see some of these other legacy data types that are a little more nuanced in the discussion, and you really have to see all CUI as a reference point. When it comes from the government, goes to your systems, you need to protect it. If you're generating as a work product underneath the performance of a contract that says, yea, verily, this work product, whether it's a technical report, engineering schematics, et cetera, once the government says, yes, that is going to be CUI, you must follow their marking instruction for that data. So let's talk about that FCI versus CUI. So one of the things I want to show you is the progression of what is in your contracts now, and then what we anticipate we'll be seeing in the contracts by 2025, and later for some of you, but we know that that's going to be hopefully a threshold date for the DOD. What you see here is that FAR clause that we started out helping us define what FCI is, that bare minimum threshold. But you see the blue arrow as it goes to CMMC-ML1. So the main difference between these two requirements is requiring a certification and a framework process that is delivered by the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification process. And this, like any other maturity model, when we look at the capability maturity models, there's a layered progression to starting out at ground zero, where you don't have anything documented. That's your level 1 controls. As of December of last year, they basically made this CMMC process 3 steps instead of 5, because those were the 3 certification layers that you could adhere to. So you notice that the DFAR's 7012 clause says, thou shalt implement the NIST 800-171 security framework practices. And right now, if you have the DFAR's clause, you must self-attest your score under the government's database called SPRS, which sits under PIEE database. And you'll see that the red controls that are the 110 CUI controls map to the level 2, but you also notice that those 17 controls you did under the FAR clause get inherited. They're part of those 110 controls that are now level 1 controls. So everything you should be doing now, because this has been in contracts, the DFARS clause has a specific date to it. That was December 31st, 2017. So basically, if this was in your contract, the government anticipates you are already doing NIST 800-171 regardless of a certification standard. And that is why you have to self-attest your score. And the score is up against these 110 controls. But what nobody really tells you is the first things you have to do are the 60 NFO controls. They appear in Appendix E of the NIST 800-171. And they contain a tailoring marking that says these controls must be satisfied without specification. We don't have to tell you to do them. They are your baseline controls, and a lot of them are policy driven. So when you look at a number of these NFO controls, it's like the -1 level controls that say you must have a policy and procedure. Ultimately, what you are scored against, however, is the 110 controls. To show you all of this is to show you the greater context of right now the FAR and DFARS clause relies on you self-attesting your score. I really recommend that you get a professional third party to score you. There is a scoring metric for it. Don't try to score yourself without talking to a company that provides that, like my company. But in the next few years, we're going to be shifting towards a certification model. And the DOD, as of last December, has put out kind of guidelines for how they're rolling that out. And there's still going to be a layer of level 2 personnel who have the DFAR 7012 in their organizational contracts. And under level 2, they'll still be able to self-attest for some time. So safeguarding, when we come down to safeguarding, we've really covered this, right? For anything that is FCI level, we have a minimum meet the controls in the FAR clause. We know they cross map to the NIST 800-171 and the CMMC level 1 controls. And then for CUI, there's the DFAR 7012 and the CMMC level 2. As I just showed you, those are the same controls. So you should be doing this either way. For CMMC level 3, it used to be level 5 as of December 12th, they've changed it. And so what we're seeing is a combination of the full set of controls for NIST 800-171, and we don't know how many controls from NIST 800-172. They did have 40 controls on top of it. They are still reevaluating that. We'll know more here in the future. So poll number 2, I'm going to turn it over to our pollster to get this read.
Thanks, Christina. Poll number 2, what exactly are you waiting for? I know there's probably going to be a variety of answers here. For the DOD to make up their minds. Number 2, my budget to appear. Number 3, the C-suite to push the button. Number 4, no worries, I got her done. So let's launch that poll. All right, we've got terrific. We've got a lot of folks. 43% of our respondents said they got it done. That's awesome. We are still waiting for DOD, some of us, as well as budgets, and some waiting for the C-suite as well. So there you go, Christina.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all feel the pain. One way or the other for any of those answers. I feel the pain. And I agree with everybody. All right, make sure my slides are rolling. There we go. So I'm going to go over one of the most important documents that's going to be thrown in front of you when you have any questions with your contract authority. Typically what they say is, here's the DOD Instruction 5200.48. Go read it and stop bothering us. So that's typically the response, tongue in cheek, but in all seriousness, we've been receiving. And so it really helps if you do download this document and understand what it says. And I'm going to break out a few things that I've pulled out and I almost use as a reference source on a daily basis with my clients. So here's what that instruction looks like. Download it, read it, know it. When you start your CUI program, this is a wealth of information use this to start here when we're not just talking about how do I apply NIST 800-171. And you'll note that in this presentation, I'm not going to go into all the technical stuff about NIST 800-171. I give a number of presentations in conjunction with Bill on this. Need to catch one of our other ones. This is really about putting together not only in documentation what your CUI program looks like, but how you train your personnel, how you label your documents. From a safeguarding perspective, we can get to that point later. So from the CUI perspective, this DOD instruction establishes the policy, it assigns responsibilities and prescribes procedures for CUI throughout the DOD in accordance with that famous Executive Order 13556. And it establishes the official DOD CUI registry, of which is under the National Archives. So a few things I want you to take from this. So just digging through the document, there's some things I liked and some things I'm going to pull out and put in front of you. So as you dig through it, that kind of down in the bottom, 5.3 requirements for DOD contractors. It says whenever the DOD provides information to contractors, and this is of course our technical data, our CUI data, our FCI data, it must identify, that is the DOD, must identify whether any of the information is CUI via the contracting vehicle. So again, if you are looking for things that you can pass to your contract authority to say, you must identify for us what is CUI on this program, we can't be expected to identify CUI out of thin air. We need help and assistance, not only in selecting our CUI basic level, but our CUI specified level, and then lining those up to various documents or data that will be transmitted through our network, through your network, must be encrypted, must be stored. So identification is step number one, and this is all provided when BDO does our scoping with our clients. A number of things that we will do upon the scoping is to determine what CUI legacy work products are going through the system, what current CUI products are going through the system, look at use cases, what personnel are dealing with either CUI or maybe ITAR files on a daily basis, what programs are they using to transfer that data, and we start to create a bigger picture of our authorization boundaries, the invisible barrier that we put around the CUI data, and we shove the CUI assets and the personnel who touch CUI into that authorization boundary, and that helps us establish what our network diagram looks like from there. So the first step is get more information from your contract authority. They're supposed to pass this information down in the contracting vehicle. Whenever the DOD provides CUI to or CUI is generated by non-DOD entities, that's you, protective measures and dissemination controls, and this is very critical, dissemination controls, included those directed by relevant law, regulation, or government-wide policy, will be articulated in the contract, grant, or other legal agreement. So when you receive that contract, not only are they supposed to give you marking and identification of the CUI, they're supposed to articulate the dissemination controls that attach to that specific category. So contract generated CUI, how do you know? Where do you start to ask those questions of, hey, contract officer, what is associated with this contract? What categories of CUI are we processing? How do we mark it? How do we label it? How do we know? So number one, first step is ask for a security classification guide. And I'm going to show you a part in the DODI where they say they're supposed to provide that. Number two, ask your contract authority. This can be done with an email, a written Word document you sent them and you want them to sign, a form you have them fill out, a form or other document they give you, and that leads to the third one. Ask for it. Ask for, if they can't give you a security classification guide for CUI, we're not talking about for classified data, which many of you are used to SCGs being for classified data, but guess what? They're supposed to give you an SCG for CUI data. Ask for another document or memorandum. There's lots of different ways to skin the cat, right? How we get this information, all relates back to one of my policies from a business perspective is always get everything in writing. Don't ask anything over a verbal transaction. And if you contact your legal counsels and your law firms that support your organization, that's the thing they will tell you as well. Get this in writing. Get your instructions clearly and in writing. So where does the DODI instruction say this? So when you ask for an SCG, the specific clause you're going to be pulling this out of the DOD instruction is 3.7 General DOD CUI requirements. Subsection E says, CUI will be identified in SCGs to ensure such information receives appropriate protection. And if the SCG is canceled, a memorandum or other guidance document may be issued to identify CUI instead. It says it in the DODI in black and white. So when you get a new contract award and your contract authority says everything on this contract is CUI, that's not a good answer. Because not everything will be CUI. Some things will be FCI, as we already went over. So how do you get that clarity? You have to request the written document. Request the SCG. If they don't have an SCG, again, we have other ways to skin the cat. So here's a great example of a memorandum or other guidance. It's a form that I've created for my clients, and it has all the reference points from the National Archives CUI categories at the very back of this set of worksheets, and allows you to fill out some of this information and say, hey, if we don't get an answer from you, we can't make assumptions as to what the dissemination information is going to be, what the specific categories are going to be, and it's not acceptable to just say everything is CUI. That creates a culture of overmarking, and what I have seen transacted right now is a lot of federal contract information. The contracts are being documented as CUI when they are clearly FCI because of this one little statement they make. Well, it was FOUO, and all FOUOs automatically CUI, and that is incorrect, and that is explicitly stated in the DODI. So to further move on that thought, does legacy CUI automatically become CUI? So that, pick up your DODI instruction again, section 3.2, legacy information requirements. And of course, this relates to legacy CUI information. Subsection B says, DOD legacy information does not automatically become CUI. And I highlighted that in blue so you can read it 20 times over, because we have had very similar issues pop up with some of our clients' contract authorities saying, well, this contract or an FCI document was FOUO, and FOUO is now automatically CUI. It's not how CUI becomes CUI. CUI has to be reviewed by the owner of the information, so we would call that the data originator. Whoever stamped it FOUO, whoever stamped it CUI is the data originator. The owner of the information needs to be reviewing any legacy information, like taking that FOUO. Okay, I used to stamp my contracts FOUO, but now I need to run it back through the NAIRA categories to see and click on those 48 CFR links, right? Does this meet this category? And I've had examples where I've had a few people ask about, does this information fall under, like our contract information, fall under some general procurement categories? And when you click on them and you click on those 48 CFR documents, what you will find is it may not be the information you thought you were categorizing. So what we saw with the general procurement information was that it was talking about source selection bid information being protected as CUI by the government when a contractor turns it in. Had nothing to do with contract data. So this is where the exercise needs to be performed by all involved, by the company that's receiving the federal or Department of Defense contract, by the contract authority. It has to be reviewed. And if it does not meet a CUI category, it should fall backwards to FCI or some other categorization. So that exercise has to be done first and foremost. So as you go from something like FOUO to CUI, if you were to make that designation, and let's say it was a contract or a document related to a contract award, the first thing you should do is fill out the designation indicator block. And I have some examples on the right. These are just some general examples of designation indicator blocks. And you'll see the information under the CUI categories. You'll see that it has different CUI categories for some of these different designation blocks. Now, this information has to be provided to you in terms of the contract. So it is a bad practice for anybody to be automatically converting headers and footers from FOUO to CUI without going through a CUI exercise and filling out the full designation indicator block. So, and it's also okay to request clarity. If you are receiving what is clearly a federal contract information document and you're receiving it as CUI, I always say to my clients, it is healthy and it is right to request if that document truly is CUI before you accept it on your networks. This helps us reduce the amount of overmarking that is occurring, and it also helps you as the contractor get a better understanding of what types of CUI data you're accepting into your environment before you go through all this hassle of safeguarding using the NIST 800-171 and the CMMC standards. So I'm going to turn it over for our poll number 3. I love this cartoon, makes me laugh every time.
Thanks, Christina. All right, poll number 3 from the archives of SpongeBob. Does your company process or receive CUI? 1, not that I know of. 2, not that the government knows of. Number 3, what's CUI? And number 4, can I buy a vowel? Okay, let's see those results. Yep. We need to buy some vowels, it looks like, Christina.
I think so. I hope they're not too expensive. And thank you everybody for playing along. I really meant for the polls to be just, let's have some fun and let's laugh a little bit. You know, this is a serious enough topic, and I just kind of wanted to poke some fun and talk about our process. And really, this SpongeBob cartoon could not have been more pertinent to my initial interaction with every client I've ever had. Is we don't really get CUI. Oh yeah, have you received FOUO? And then I'm like pointing to all these documents, and all of a sudden we uncover a lot of CUI that is legacy CUI. And I'll get into how that becomes CUI in a second. So let me make sure my screen is working. Okay, so I want to talk about some frequently asked questions from the ISO blogs that I really liked. And if you don't ever have an opportunity to peruse the ISO blogs, they really do answer a lot of your questions. And one of the reasons why I haven't been answering all the questions as we go along is because a lot of them are going to be answered. And I'll wait till the end and see how many we hopefully answered with what we had prepared. So number 1, who is responsible for marking CUI? I always contain the links to the ISO blogs at the bottom. If you want to peruse them anytime, all of these links are going to be here. If you just want to take a look at all the questions they've answered, there's some really good ones there. So who is responsible for marking CUI? This came from somebody who said, we have run into agencies failing to do so. And if we don't generate material, what's the contractor's responsibility? So their answer was, upon implementation, agencies are responsible for marking or identifying CUI shared with non-federal entities. Always take your questions back to the data originator. So let's say that you get legacy data like FOUO, go back to the data originator who stamped that original document. Keep in mind too, they ask for patience. Many agencies haven't fully adopted their own CUI program. They're still getting their hands around it. They're still learning. We are all on a learning curve right now. And they ask for your patience as they themselves implement elements of the CUI program as they write their security classification guides. Any contractors should not follow CUI program requirements or markings until directed to do so in a contract or agreement. I'm going to add a little stipulation onto the end of this. Ask, right? Rather than assume you have no contract requirements because it hasn't appeared in your contract yet, be proactive, ask about this. It's not, if you sweep it under the rug, it doesn't exist. Be proactive and ask your contract authority what you can do as you are establishing your own CUI program. If it has not touched you, it either already is and you don't know about it, or it will. Nobody's really going to be exempt from this, and I've seen various cases where we've had examples where we worked with Department of Defense contractors who were offering a commercial item, and you do have a COTS exemption if you sell a COTS product. But some of these contractors that we supported, let's say the DOD funded their building or funded a new facility or manufacturing, and all of a sudden the DOD, even though they sold a COTS product because the DOD was funding something large to be built that not only helped the DOD, helped their business as well, we're seeing the DFARS clause being put laterally into the contract. So don't think you are exempt from it. If you do business with the Department of Defense, you will see it at some point. And don't think if you have a COTS exemption that you are exempt. You may not be. Always discuss these issues with your legal representation. So what about legacy CUI? So when talking about legacy information, do we just wait until the government sends us new documents that are marked as CUI? So we think about FOU as one of our major examples. As agencies implement, the CUI requirements will be added to existing and new contracts. What I advise my clients to do is treat all legacy data types, which I have given you in this presentation, as if they are CUI. Go ahead and protect them. Incorrectly marked CUI. How do you navigate a situation where you feel you have received CUI, but it hasn't been marked appropriately? The answer is always going to be go back to the data originator. So the data originator that stamped it CUI is going to be the one responsible for many things: classifying it correctly, answering questions on it, decontrolling it, destroying it, making it publicly releasable, all of these things. And it only goes back to the data originator. So you may be able to talk to your contract authority. You're going to talk to your data originator if you know who that person is. If not, you go to your contract authority and say, I don't think this was marked correctly. Maybe it was marked as not marked as CUI and you're wondering how to protect it. It was marked as CUI and maybe you feel that it was perfectly justifiable for it to be federal contract information and not CUI. Go back to your contract authority. They're there to work with you. They're there to answer your questions at the end of the day. And if they can't answer your questions, odds are they have somebody at their elbow who is working in their security programs that can answer the contracts authority's questions. So we find that these exercises are never futile. They're never in vain. Ask, 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 and then document their answer. So FOU versus CUI. So is the CUI designation replacing anything that we would have labeled as FOU? I'd insert the word like automatically, which we've already covered. And we already know the answer from the DOD instruction is no, this is not an automated process. Once agencies implement the CUI program, legacy markings such as FOU or SBU will no longer be used. In many cases, what is previously marked as FOUO could potentially align and be able to be marked as CUI, but there are some information types currently marked as FOUO that won't align and qualify as CUI. So again, the big thing you want to do is go to the National Archives CUI category list and say, what category does this match up to? If you cannot find one, it's likely not going to be CUI unless your contract authority just wants it placed under CUI basic to maybe kind of meet their contract thresholds for safeguarding. And even then, I always say it's healthy to question if something is CUI or not. rather than accepting all documents that have been overmarked. I've seen a lot of indications where contract information was marked as FOUO, and it just made an automated process to CUI, and we've had to push back. It is healthy to push back. Requesting clarity means that we can safeguard this information much tighter, much cleaner, and we don't just have a lot of documents that are stamped CUI flowing around. There we go. So contract officers and CUI marking. Another question from the ISU blogs. For contracts with DOD agencies, should the contracting officer tell the contractor what is CUI and how it should be marked? And their answer is yes, that's the goal. However, agencies are still in the process of implementing the CUI program. Be sure to follow any existing requirements directing the marking or protection of unclassified information. Under the new federal acquisition regulation, a standard form is being contemplated that will require this level of granularity in all contracts where CUI is involved. The FAR is expected to be released for public comment in the summer of 2020. Now, this was as it was stated on the ISU blogs. We know that at the end of last year, 2021, this new FAR clause, and this may be new to some of you, but what they are currently trying to do is release a new FAR clause, not the one we just pointed out, but a brand new one. The purpose of this FAR clause is, we think, going to be bringing that NIST 800-171 requirement up to the federal contract level. What does that mean for you? It means that it's going to take the cybersecurity framework requirements for the protection and safeguarding of CUI to the federal level. So that means we're going to see it more in GSA contracts, NASA contracts, IRS, DHS. We're going to see it broadly sweeping across the board as a means of securing sensitive data in all federal contracts. And this is something that has been evolving. So be on the lookout and keep looking at BDO sources as we put out information when that FAR clause will be coming out. So cover sheets. We know that marking is not only a big requirement for these programs, but we also see that the cover sheets are going to change. So things that you might have seen, Privacy Act cover sheets, or for official use only. And again, privacy, where you're sending your PII, PHI into the government, they're sending you theirs. That's where that kind of comes into play, is converting to CUI. So we'll see this new SF 901 that's authorized. It's a cover sheet for any printed material and documents. And then you can also put this cover sheet on digital documents as well, so that we are properly marking the document. You also want to put your markings both in the header and the footer of each document. So upon the implementation of the CUI program, and that again is when your agencies that you support effectively roll out a comprehensive CUI program, you'll see that the requirement will switch from the old cover sheets for official use only will start to migrate into CUI if it's gone through that review process. We also talk about something called a need to know. So we know in classified world, personnel who need to access classified information have a need to know. For CUI, they have something very similar. They call it a lawful government purpose. And lawful government purpose is any activity, mission, function, operation, or endeavor that the U.S. government authorizes or recognizes within the scope of its legal authorities or the legal authorities of non-executive branch entities, such as state and local law enforcement. How does this even play in with what you do? So I mentioned that in our scoping for the environment, we put together a use case, which personnel are going to be interacting with CUI. So typically I have them sign a little NDA form if they're going to be transmitting CUI, receiving CUI, storing CUI, processing, generating CUI, and we will designate these CUI users as having a lawful government purpose. So that is equivocal to need to know, but it is more akin to unclassified but sensitive data. So we're going to come back around to this PII, PHI discussion. So I really want to make clear that your own PII and PHI stored on your organizational systems for your own employees is covered under privacy controls. And we know a number of privacy controls for PII and PHI include HIPAA, Privacy Act, GLBA, FERPA, COPPA, FCRA. So all of these sorts of privacy controls are related to your privacy data. But the minute you send, and we're seeing this now, your employees may have a form they have to fill out for their vaccinations that says this is CUI when filled in. And so we've had a few clients kind of nervous about, okay, if they fill this in, is this CUI? Where do they store it? Do they secure it? My recommendation for those vaccination forms is have them printed out. It is not CUI until it's filled in. And when they are asked to do so, fill it in, provide the information, and physically hand it to their contract authorities that are requesting that information. I don't like them to pre-fill it in, have it be CUI at that point, and they keep it in their pocket, they keep it in their unlocked desk drawer, whatever, just because the government put that label on that vaccination form. So when we look at some of this data, we really control and train our personnel how to use CUI-based documents and understand when PII, again, becomes CUI, is in that transfer to the other system. So if your PII goes to the government, they have to protect it as CUI. Their PII and PHI, if you, for instance, run a database for the VA, you have to protect their information as if it's CUI. Okay. So is PII CUI basic or specified, such as the category SP privacy information? Their answer is it depends on which CUI category applies to the information in question. There's numerous privacy categories of CUI. Again, let's go back to the contract authority. Let's go back to the data originator. Let's establish what our program needs to mark if we are processing privacy data on behalf of the government. And let's figure out how we best safeguard and document and label that information. So what happens if we have a contract officer that either doesn't know, maybe they don't have good information, or they haven't been able to provide you information, and you have no information to go on for the category of CUI, regardless of asking for it or trying to get some other sources. So right now, according to the IC blogs, they say that contractors are bound by the terms of their contracts or agreements. So we have to follow that. And again, try to get an SCG that's supposed to be bound to your contract for the purposes of CUI. And any CUI questions need to be pulled back to the contracting authority. And if you don't get an SCG, let's use that additional form to collect information. And I think it puts everything in a nice, neat context for getting that additional information you might be lacking. How will sensitive unclassified information that was marked prior to the implementation of the CUI program be handled? So there's a couple of different things on that. So if, let's say we take, for example, an FOUO document, let's say they never go back and never touch it ever again. Are they required to go back and take this old legacy document they never edited and reopen it and make it CUI? The answer there is no. If they never open up this old FOUO document or look to change it, it may stay FOUO forever. However, if they take this old FOUO document and they open it because they need to make new modifications to the document, the minute they open it back up, it is supposed to be brought to a determination as to whether or not that will correctly be labeled as CUI. So notice I don't want to say it's an automatic interpretation that FOUO becomes CUI, because we've clearly established it does not. So we always want to do that exercise of, okay, the old document had FOUO on it. Do we really need to put this document up to the level of CUI? Or can we bring it back down to maybe an FCI level and still safeguard that under the FCI controls? So another poll, our last one, just to have some fun.
Yes, best poll yet. Involving all of our canine coworkers that we have been enjoying at home. We're asking you to rate doggo support. And this dog is cute. Do you agree? Who doesn't love a good dog meme? Number 2, my personal favorite, I want to eat his face. He's so cute. Number 3, I am a cat person. Confession, I do have 2 cats lounging in my living room right now. And 4, I love IT crowd. So go ahead, let us know what you're thinking. Oh my gosh, early on, fellow cat person that voted. I believe they will be quickly outpaced by the dog crowd, as we often are. All right, looks like we're all in. Yep, who doesn't love a good dog meme, right?
Very good, very good. And a shout out to nobody who knew the answer for IT crowd except for a select nerdy few. Shout out to all of you who love IT crowd. It is a BBC show that appeared in the kind of early to mid 2000s. Highly hilarious. My 8-year-old loves watching it. And when I get on my Discord channel with all of my CMMC folks, my my son will come into the room and say, "Are you talking to your IT crowd?" And I say, "Yes." These are my people. Very good. Thank you guys for all playing along. That was our last poll. I want to go over the few last elements of your program, which is what happens when you need to decontrol. If this were classified information, we call it declassification, but for unclassified information, it's called decontrol, or destroy the documents once you have created them. And this can apply to documents, this can apply to your media, it can apply to a broad range of things. So first and foremost, how do we, outside of the discussion of like email, and obviously, you know, that takes the technical turn, what about all the other ways of transmitting CUI? So much like classified information, it can be transmitted via first class mail, parcel post, bulk shipment, don't have to double wrap it. It can be transmitted electronically via secure website, hopefully with SSL or some other means of FIPS 140-2 encryption, secure communication systems. Be very careful if you're sending it over email that you do encrypt any external documents that you apply to that email. Avoid wireless telephone transmission of CUI. Typically, obviously, we're talking about discussing it, but anything that you might be sending, a picture, even text, that's going to be telephone transmission of CUI. So unless you have a very highly secured corporate device, I just suggest you don't and transmit CUI on a secured corporate device. And then and this is very similar to what we did with classified information. You are allowed CUI transmission via facsimile. I know, who sends a fax anymore, but yet it still happens. The basis of fax machines is you have to have somebody standing at the other end to receive it. You can't just randomly send somebody a fax and then 2 hours later say, "Oh yeah, I sent you a fax." They have to be standing at the other end, and I would encourage that you use the cover sheets to send it. And that is our marking cover sheet. So destruction of CUI, if you have to destroy CUI of any kind, so we're talking paper documents, any media materials, hard drives, USB thumb drives, first and foremost, as a good manner of processing it, process it through your records management procedures. Does that mean you need to have a records management procedure? I would say yes. It really would behoove you to have, you know, here's what we destroyed when we destroyed it. If you're destroying thousands and thousands of different documents, you probably won't be logging each one of those documents. But a hard drive, getting that through a document control procedure is a good habit to follow. The destruction method must make CUI unreadable, indecipherable, and irrecoverable. So there's 2 approved methods, and I'm going to insert one more of my own. The 2 approved methods are crosscut shredding that produces a 1 millimeter by 5 millimeter particles or smaller, and pulverizing. The secret option number 3 is just incineration. Incineration has to take it up to a high enough temperature that you can burn documents, you can burn hard drives, and there is no material retained. Now, we don't typically, from a hard drive perspective, always say that the drill press is going to destroy all the information on the drive. That is why I prefer to send my hard drives through the crosscut shredder or incineration, my favorite being incineration. And we usually get a third-party company to do that on our behalf. So any of our CUI external drives, we put into a big box, we label it CUI, We do our records management process, which will be serial number of the hard drive, basically what was on it. We don't have to go into great detail, just what did we have on it? Did it contain CUI? And then when we dispose of that through the third party company, we have that record. What did we dispose? What was on it? And that they give us some sort of certificate for burning. So decontrol. So this is when we take the controlled CUI document and we bring it back down to an unclassified and potentially publicly releasable format. Not necessarily publicly releasable, but at least decontrolling it down to a lower threshold. So it must be executed by the data originator or the original classification authority. So the person who originally stamped it is the only person or entity who can authorize a decontrol. You have to have that person or the position. So if it was a contract officer or some other person that is serving that role or function, that person is going to be the one to decontrol it. Hopefully that person will be identified in the SCG that you receive. Pre-publication review of unclassified information is required to public release. So I just worked with one of my clients that we talked about what was posted to their website, because of course there's one control and the level 1 controls that say, you know, do you publish anything that's related to FCI, and at the higher level CUI to a public website, social media account. So one of the good suggestions was to create a public release policy. How do we know when to release FCI publicly? How do we know how to sanitize it? How do we know when to release CUI and decontrol it? And basically in the policy, we say we don't release CUI. And if we have to, it has to go through an internal review process, whether or not it was ever subject to control. And when the CUI is decontrolled, all known handlers will be notified by email or other means. And upon notification, those holders, if they have a copy of the document, they'll remove the CUI markings. Unlike classified information, which typically had a 25-year declassify cycle, there's no specific timelines to decontrol CUI. So we don't have a set time period where it automatically becomes decontrol. It will occur when the CUI no longer requires safeguarding. And again, we follow the records management procedures. So decontrolling CUI through the public release process. So if you were to post CUI material publicly, relieves authorized holders from requirements for handling information. Now, typically, we want to leave that sort of public release to the government. We don't want to post CUI publicly without a formal review and decontrol process. So this is typically if you were holding CUI and the government posts it publicly, they have to perform this pre-publication review. They have to follow the DOD instructions listed below before any public release may be authorized. So safeguarding, as we've gone over, we know what our logical safeguarding requirements are. I'll hit on those in a second. But basically, you want to get yourself a locking file cabinet, a locking drawer, or a locking room. Anything that you can lock with a key with restricted access to that key is going to be within the means of physical safeguarding, and that minimizes the risk of access by unauthorized personnel. And after working hours, you're going to lock everything up. So paper documents, hard drives, laptops, or if you have systems, what we do is we make one room in the organization, like our CUI control room. We put a PIN code on that door, and then we only have we'll post a list of authorized personnel to go into that CUI room, and we maintain PIN code access only to the authorized list. So that's another way. If you have a lot of big systems that manage CUI, you can't fit them into a drawer, can't fit them into the filing cabinet, but you can fit them into the room and you can lock that room up. And then you need to look at your physical safeguarding access for after hours employees like janitorial staff. And I recommend that you just don't give them access to that room. Logical safeguarding, we've gone over that. The NIST SP 800-171 for non-federal systems, we typically abide by CUI having a confidentiality, integrity, availability of moderate with moderate impact to the system. If you don't know what that is, come see us and we'll talk about risk assessments and how we perform them for your system. It abides by the moderate confidentiality specifically for CUI. So any security incidents, what happens if you have unauthorized disclosure? Within your organization, no formal security inquiry or investigation is required unless you need to take disciplinary action. Some of the disciplinary action you may take with relation to basic CUI might be enforcing cybersecurity training and CUI training for that personnel. Where more administrative, civil, and criminal actions start to impose is when you get into the export control data like ITAR. That's where it may result in potential civil and criminal sanctions. As far as CUI goes, I think a lot of it can be addressed by filing an incident report or an event within the company as an internal report and mandating that that user attend training based on the impact of the unauthorized disclosure. And I've got a number of training resources in here. Now, first and foremost, once we have the lawful government purpose established for personnel within a CUI program, who needs access to CUI and who does not, first thing you're going to do is go the training down below through the Security Hub USA Learning. That's the first thing you're going to make them take. Follow up Cyber Awareness Challenge. The public cyber.mil training is also another good resource. I recommend these to be distributed to CUI users as often as needed and renewed yearly. And then you're going to follow the CUI Markings Handbook for a full and complete how to mark CUI from A to Z. They give you every single format from emails to documents to media labels, and also information on destruction and equipment labels. And those sorts of labels you'll see will look like this. The left, we have the cover sheet. The right on the top, we have the Information Security Oversight Office, the ISOO, and they have this approved for destruction label, which is very, very handy, helps you track this information. You can just take a picture of it if you don't want to fill out a big old form, and take this label off and classify it when you go to destroy the material. And then we also have markings for, typically we use the larger one here for things like laptops and desktop systems, and the smaller one at the bottom for USB thumb drives. And then I highly encourage you to familiarize yourself very, very well with the CUI registry and learn how to dig so that you can justify what is or is not CUI in your program. Familiarize yourself with this. And if you have any questions, you can come see BDO and we can help you process this information. If you did not receive an SCG, how do we align these contract information types and be able to distinguish between FCI and CUI and make sure that we know, what we're looking at. And we have, in addition, when you receive this, a lot of different links I really highly suggest you click on for further information, for really understanding scoping and guidance, and for achieving just some additional levels of awareness and training for your security staff, for your senior executives, and for the individuals that will be processing CUI in your organization. And that's it. I know that was long. I really appreciate everybody bearing with me. This gives you a CUI primer from A to Z for your program. If you have any questions, my contact information is at the back of this information. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're going to be sending some follow-up documents, including this full slide deck, as well as some other pertinent information that you might find useful.
Yep, that's correct, Christina. Wasn't sure if Bill wanted to join us. We do have some questions. I know that he was fielding a few here. Let's see. I believe he was going to pop back in. Yep, great. Bill, did you have some questions that you wanted to talk through with Christina?
So, Christina, I know you were following along, and there's, I think we actually got a lot of the questions answered. A couple different here that probably are worth talking to. One of them is with respect to marking. Much of what we produce as a software company is digital in nature and not a classic document. How would that be handled from a marking standpoint?
Yeah, and it really comes back to all types of data can be classified as CUI, and what you may have to do internal to your software is include markings, depending on how your software is formulated, that include markings for specific data. This may be done in various ways, and I just don't know what their output looks like, but I would at least come back to the data originator, your contract officer, and say, you know, this is what we're handling. It is CUI. How do we correctly mark this? Now, sometimes for specific software, you might have the GUI interface, and at the very top, if everything under that particular enclave of data applies to CUI, you might have a header that will label that as CUI. So this is an exercise that needs to be taken back to your contract authority.
Yeah, and I would also probably suggest anything around that software, much like a piece of hardware or a military component. Any diagrams, any drawings, any technical specifications, all of that would probably kind of fall into that area as well. Great answer. We have another question here. If older tech does not have specific CTI marking, but they do have distribution B, C, or D, is the government defaulting any of these to CUI?
Yes, I have already seen some of my clients have those distribution statements, and when we posed the question back to the contract officer and we said, what is CUI under this contract? They said everything. Again, we're coming back to the blanket statement that I think some contract officers, until they iron out the wrinkles in their own program, they're taking utmost caution for everything that's executed under that program. So what I do is I start with the distribution statements, and I go back to the contract officer and say, we take that form that I showed you, and I try to pre-fill it in with the categories of CUI that I think most closely align, and ask the contract officer, if they've not given you an SCG, do you agree? And then we list out different document types. So we might have manuals, we might have technical engineering drawings. Let's list all of those document types out and then say, this is where we believe the CUI category is. Now, you may also create that form and go back to them and say, we believe this is not CUI, and let them make the argument or mandate that it is.
It seems like we're in this place where the pendulum has swung. For a long time, there was nothing coming out of government in terms of marking, and now I guess someone's gotten the email or the training, and now we've kind of flipped over to the other side where maybe they're overcompensating a little bit and still trying to find that happy balance.
Yeah, I think we had a very lively LinkedIn discussion the other day from Jacob Horn, who said, welcome the era of overmarking. And I think as we refine and we understand these programs better, it really takes the two parties, not just your contract authorities, but the contractor saying, we want to understand this. Don't just tell us everything is CUI. Can we get into a discussion of what is actually CUI, so that we don't have to overprotect everything in our environment that doesn't need that level of protection?
Absolutely, no doubt. Great, as always. Another question here: how is legacy data handled when a contract is completed and the COs, or I guess contracting officers, are no longer around?
So that goes back to a great question, what I originally said a few slides back, where I said, if that contract officer is gone, whoever took their place will be the next one you ask, because it may not be a person by name, it may be a role. So it may be the contract officer over a particular contract. They're going to become the new data originator for you. It might also be a specific office or agency that technically takes that onus.
Great point. Fantastic. I may butcher this question a little bit. I think it is, where do we tell if CTI we generate is special CUI? NAIRA just says determined by the applicable safeguarding and/or dissemination authority for a given instance. So.
And I typically say, if you already know you have CTI, it's CUI. So we at least know it's going to meet the basic safeguarding. But if you know you have CTI and it falls under, and I think they do a good job defining CTI within that category, that if it falls under any of those descriptions, my baseline stance would be to fill out, again, that document form saying, okay, these are our technical instruction documents. They might be engineering schematics, they might be manuals, they might be field reports. and we're going to list them out by document type. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say CUI/SP, and then the control technical information sublevel type. I'm going to fill those out. I'm going to send them to my contract officer and say, can you look this over and sign it? Is it correct? Now you may take a more restrictive stance. You may say, we believe that these data types are not CUI, but you better have a darn good reason why they don't fit the CTI if you already know they fit the CTI category. So I think at default, you're going to look under defense, CTI subcategory, and then request the instruction. I mean, we really can't bang that drum loud enough that when in doubt, ask, and document as much as possible, because while your contract officer may not have a clear answer now, they will have one. And I think it, like I said, takes two parties to clarify the stance on CUI.
Fantastic, good stuff. Only a couple more. I think this is actually a really good one. Our proprietary design and drawing info is used by multiple programs and defense contractors. It is CUI no foreign in some applications and is rightly ITAR. No government office owns the information or manages it. How do you mark it, including limiting dissemination?
Yeah, so this is where we get into the ITAR category. And while I touch safeguarding of ITAR, I really leave, we even have inside of BDO a whole ITAR export controlled practice. And this is exactly what they do all day, every day. So what we tend to do is our practice that really aligns with GovCon cybersecurity will bring in an ITAR specialist that deals with any and all export control data. And they, I think for like $2,500, they come in and they do an analysis. What do you have? What TAA type of agreements do you have in place? Where are you sending it? Where is it being stored? And we actually work in tandem. And this is where I really have to say, go find those legal counterparts to what you and I do, Bill, that say, we understand an ITAR program. These are much more specific, very contract mandated, very government regulated programs. And even if it's your proprietary design, if the government has stamped no foreign or ITAR on that contract, you now have a whole new set of restrictions within that category of CUI that you need to abide by.
Yeah, there's a great trade group by the name of, I think it's Society for International Affairs, that does a tremendous job. Their whole purpose in life is training around ITAR and EAR programs. And they do wonderful couple-day seminars on how to understand, looking through the ITAR regulation, does something qualify or doesn't it? I've taken some of that training. It's really detailed. It's really informative. But you're right, it's its own subspecialty. I think one area that I would say on this question is, if it's their drawings and their designs, they are the ones that have created it, so they have a little more control over being able to mark that. And I'd probably take the second point on that of, if it's ITAR, it's CUI, easy answer there, and don't sleep on the fact that that has the additional data sovereignty requirement layered in on top of it.
Right. And we have to be especially careful when you have like exchange servers for your company that are outside the US. And now all this data is flowing through that. That's where we get into a lot of trouble with that. And salespeople we tend to see a lot of like ITAR schematics that are sent to you from the government to print one small subcomponent of a larger schematic. So you're receiving these huge ITAR schematics. We see a lot of salespeople that are tasked to send these schematics back and forth to obtain a quote, but we're also noticing that we lose a lot of the safeguardings in that process. And so part of our job is to have those ITAR groups come in, do the analysis, and once we know where ITAR, what regulations surround it, where it is being sent, what it is being processed through, if it's an external exchange server or a cloud-based server it doesn't have that US data sovereignty, that's where we need to start, especially with those programs.
Yeah, it's important to know that those are not equal. ITAR is CUI, but protecting CUI doesn't meet the standard for protecting ITAR. There are additional things in there around the data sovereignty. Really tremendously complicates your strategy from a deployment standpoint, and gives you a much higher bar than maybe what CMMC or NIST is asking for because of that data sovereignty. So great answer on that. I think you may have answered this in the presentation, but I want to cover it. Are cover sheets only required for printed documents?
I typically put them in all generated documents if we know it's going to be CUI, because then we can't mistake that document for any other labeled document. It also protects you if somebody is on the receiving end of that document and they go to print it and now they're printing it without a cover sheet. So it's really easy. It's usually just a PDF that you just stick into the document, and then you need to go into the document and make sure your footer and header both have either controlled or CUI, or a CUI basic, or some sort of mixed category between the two.
Fantastic. I have one more question here. I think this might be the last one. Where can I get a good FCI/CUI program, SOP template, or draft version? And I think the short answer is going to be reach out to you directly, right?
Yeah, and that's a majority. There's a few different sources, and we've got some really good people from the CMMC community, like Compliance Forge, that they sell templates. We sell templates, but we sell it with all of our labor to help you build all the wording in the template. So that's our specialty here at BDO, is we work with all of our clients within a CMMC or a NIST focused program for 800-171, and we address writing a policy and a procedure for each one of the families. We build out your system security plan and all the related documents. So even when I say that, like, we try to build like one giant document for your policies and your procedures for each one of the security control families. But there's all these little documents that they point to that you also have to build. So all those external documents that are attached to each family, we do all of that in our program. So, and I'm going to tell you, that is the quickest, easiest way to build your own program, is to come to a company like BDO, where we basically perform an assessment. Once we have that scoping in the environment, we assess what you have. We help you fill in the gaps with either technology, administrative processes, and then once we've filled in the gaps, we write a policy around what you say you're going to do, and then a procedure around what you are actually doing. We help you collect the evidence, and then all of this goes into your readiness package. Whether you need to get a certification or not, you need to have these policies written for your organization to effectively implement CUI safeguarding.
Fantastic. Always fantastic. We do get one last question here. Are distribution statements still being used?
To my knowledge, yes. But with particular application to CUI, what we saw in that previous statement was there's a distribution statement format that you will reference and look at the CUI marking aid. You can look back on my slide that we talked about the distribution statements for CUI. It doesn't look like the classified ones. It looks a little bit different. And this is where you need that input from your contract authority, because you don't always know everything you're going to be putting in that distribution statement. So as you're deciding what CUI category you have, start putting together what those distribution statements are for the document. And again, we don't, like classified, we don't have a decontrol by. There is no date. It's decontrolled when and if the original originator is darn good and ready, or it no longer needs safeguarding.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, that's all of our questions. This is a difficult topic. It's a confusing topic. Frankly, the stuff I do is much easier than some of this, mostly because we're acting and working with imperfect information. We all know that the information coming from the government, from a lot of these state owners, is at best inconsistent, and they're struggling to kind of come to terms with everything. Certainly awesome presentation, Christina. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Bill.
Not only did you kind of define everything, but I think you gave incredible advice on where contractors can go back and ask the right questions, or even in the right situations, push back on what they're getting from their contracts. This is the first part of it. We'll have more sessions. We'll start talking about system boundaries and all of those other components in future webinars. But this is such an important foundation that so many people overlook. So thank you so much for being a part of it. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.